Hello and welcome to this News9 special. The ASEAN is considered one of the most influential groupings of countries in the world, and it is said to be a group of nations that has the potential to drive the economic growth of the world. It has in fact proven itself as Asian tigers, but however, when it comes to engaging with them, India has been slow. But however, that policy was also changed, and now we can say that deeper engagement with ASEAN has been giving the kind of dividends that we would have expected. And India and several other countries such as the United States, China, Japan and Australia are also in dialogue partners with this particular grouping. Now, one of the things that has been with regards to this particular group is trade and security ties. It is to be noted that recently we did have defense ties established with the Philippines, which is one of the member groups of the ASEAN. With Vietnam also, we share a very good personal ties, as well as to also ensure that some of our defense products have become quite lucrative as well with the Vietnamese also. However, Prime Minister Modi's engagement with the leaders of the bloc, that has in fact shown that India is still pursuing the fact that deepening ties with ASEAN is core and pillar of its Look East policy. The Prime Minister did speak at the summit, and he also interacted on a one-on-one basis with the ASEAN leaders as well. Let's listen into what the Prime Minister had to say at that summit.
राष्ट्रपति विडोडो, योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, नमस्कार। हमारी पार्टनरशिप हमने चौथे दशक में प्रवेश कर रही है। ऐसे में भारत आसियान समिट, उसको को-चेयर करना मेरे लिए बहुत ही प्रसन्नता का विषय है। इस समिट के शानदार आयोजन के लिए राष्ट्रपति विडोडो को मैं हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं और उनका आभार व्यक्त करता हूं, और आसियान समूह की कुशल अध्यक्षता के लिए उनको बहुत बहुत बधाई, बहुत बहुत अभिनंदन। कंबोडिया के प्रधानमंत्री हिज एक्सेलेंसी हुन मानेट को हाल ही में पदभार ग्रहण करने के लिए मैं हार्दिक बधाई देता हूं। मैं इस बैठक में ऑब्जर्वर के रूप में तिमोर लेस्ते के प्रधानमंत्री हिज एक्सेलेंसी सेनाना गुजमाओ का भी हृदय से स्वागत करता हूं। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, हमारी हिस्ट्री और ज्योग्राफी भारत और आसियान को जोड़ते हैं। साथ ही साझा वैल्यूज, क्षेत्रीय एकता, शांति, समृद्धि और मल्टीपोलर वर्ल्ड में साझा विश्वास भी हमें आपस में जोड़ता है। आसियान भारत की एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी का केंद्रीय स्तंभ है। भारत आसियान सेंट्रलिटी और इंडो पैसिफिक पर आसियान के आउटलुक का पूर्ण समर्थन करता है। भारत के इंडो पैसिफिक इनिशिएटिव में भी आसियान क्षेत्र का प्रमुख स्थान है। पिछले वर्ष हमने भारत आसियान फ्रेंडशिप ईयर मनाया और आपसी संबंधों को एक कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप का रूप दिया। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, आज वैश्विक अनिश्चितताओं के माहौल में भी हर क्षेत्र में हमारे आपसी सहयोग में लगातार प्रगति हो रही है। यह हमारे संबंधों की ताकत और रेजिलियंस का प्रमाण है। इस वर्ष की आसियान समिट की थीम है आसियान मैटर्स, एपिसेंट्रम ऑफ ग्रोथ। आसियान मैटर्स क्योंकि यहां सभी की आवाज सुनी जाती है, और आसियान इज एपिसेंट्रम ऑफ ग्रोथ क्योंकि वैश्विक विकास में आसियान क्षेत्र की अहम भूमिका है। वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर की यही भावना भारत की G20 अध्यक्षता की भी थीम है। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, 21वीं सदी एशिया की सदी है, हम सबकी सदी है। इसके लिए आवश्यक है कि हम एक रूल्स बेस्ड पोस्ट कोविड वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर का निर्माण और मानव कल्याण के लिए सबका प्रयास, फ्री और ओपन इंडो पैसिफिक की प्रगति में और ग्लोबल साउथ की आवाज को बुलंद करने में हम सबके साझे हित है। मुझे विश्वास है कि आज हमारी बातचीत से भारत और आसियान क्षेत्र के भावी भविष्य को और सुदृढ़ बनाने के लिए नए संकल्प लिए जाएंगे। कंट्री कोऑर्डिनेटर सिंगापुर आगामी अध्यक्ष लाओ पीडीआर और आप सभी के साथ भारत कंधे से कंधा मिलाकर काम करने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध है। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Well, the Prime Minister was also, in fact, given a rousing welcome in Indonesia by the diaspora. Many of them were, in fact, quite excited to see the Prime Minister when he came to Jakarta. There was a lot from the diaspora in Jakarta who were actually waiting for the Prime Minister to come in. They were able to also interact with him. Let's listen to some of the reactions coming in from the diaspora in Indonesia.
We are here from Indonesian community who loves India, Indonesian ladies here, right? And we are excited to meet Mr. Modi, and we are happy, so happy to meet him.
We are here, Indonesian ladies, and we love Modi. So we are so excited to meet him and to welcome him to Indonesia.
Welcome to Mr. Narendra Modi to Indonesia, Jakarta.
I'm from Bolidi, so today my team have a good chance to do a dance opening to for coming Mr. Prime Minister Modi ji. So it will a very great experience for us, and so thank you so much to Ma'am Lila as our leader from India, and that is really nice to see him, and then I grab with him.
It was really a very thrilling experience for all of us, especially all these Indonesian girls. They were so excited to meet him and they danced for him. मेरे घर राम आए. You know, it is their like इनका घर है और इनके घर पे आज राम का आगमन हुआ है. So they are very happy.
Yeah, very happy. Yeah.
Aini, happy India. You can see these all girls are in Indian costume and they are so happy to dance on Bharatiya Veshbhusha में भारतीय गीतों पर नृत्य करना.
So the welcome that was accorded to the Prime Minister when he had entered the hall, and you can see the entire place was in fact decked up with the tricolour, and hundreds of people from the diaspora were present as the Prime Minister entered the hall. You can see how much of excitement it was there at that location, where he also interacted with the diaspora members and also people from Indonesia as well. We're also now, in fact, joined in by Suresh K. Goel, who is a former Indian diplomat. We'll also be joined in by Sandeep Dixit, Associate Editor with the Tribune. When Mr. Goel, the first thing that I noticed is that India has always been trying to engage with the ASEAN region for quite some time. One, of course, the cultural affinity that is there, the shared history and geography that we are in fact looking at. This engagement, however, has come quite late because we were engaged with the Cold War, we were too much preoccupied with Europe and then in Africa. But then suddenly you realize that this huge economic bloc just in our neighborhood, which we can have close trade ties with, and they are culturally having an affinity with us. We have civilizational ties with them, and many of them have imbibed India's culture at large. But this realization came quite late when it comes to India's foreign policy decision makers, but better late than never?
Absolutely. In fact, I started my diplomatic career in Singapore, then I went on to Malaysia, and therefore I've experienced the kind of difference that came in a relationship between India and ASEAN in 1990s, early 90s. Let me just make one, you're absolutely right in whatever you said. There is just one correction here, that the engagement between India and the Southeast Asian countries is not even from 1991. It has always been there. Please remember that Cambodia, basically cultural factor, but remember Myanmar, called Burma at that time, the huge Indian community that used to live there, and in fact the Indian mission in Rangoon, called at that time Rangoon, was located in the LIC building. LIC was the main economic entity in Burma at that time. Burma Shell operated on the basis of Burma name. Similarly, we had great relations with Cambodia. We had great relations with Laos. India was chairing the ICSC in 1950 for the resolution of Indo-China war. Therefore, all I'm saying is that the relationship was there, but it acquired a greater component, much more intensive economic component in 1990s when we realized that on the basis of a free economy, capitalist economy, free economy, these countries in ASEAN had progressed so much faster, and there was a great potential for economic engagement then with India and these countries. And then we used culture as the bridge between us to promote that economic engagement. And then we came on to the early 2000s when Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was looking at the overall geopolitical and geo-economic situation. And if you recall, it is he who said, when he was trying to get India into the East Asia Summit, and it is he who said that ASEAN requires two engines to fly. If he gave the analogy of ASEAN as a plane, and the two wings would be China and India. He had always imagined India as a kind of a balancing strategic entity in the region. And that is what is now happening. India and China are coming out to be really not as competitors, but as two powers which economically, not militarily so much, but strategically and politically, are working together to balance each other out and to basically turn the competition between them into some kind of a balancing situation in Indo-Pacific. As Indo-Pacific power, India has a good role to play in ASEAN, and I think all the ASEAN countries are recognize that. It was Prime Minister Modi who said that ASEAN will be always central to Indo-Pacific. So we recognize the role being played by ASEAN in the whole game of the situation evolving in ASEAN, and it's good to know that we continue to grow our trade and economic cooperation in a very significant manner.
Well, it's also interesting that one more new component has been added to it, that is defense ties. With Philippines, we have defense ties. We've been going out of our way to actually sell our latest BrahMos missile, which is one of our technological marvels and probably the sharpest of our weapons that we have in our arsenal. And we are also ready to share with them. At the same time, even Vietnam has immense interest with regard to tie-ups with defense projects with India. So we are looking at a different component at the same time. But since you mentioned China, I mean, I thought we'll take it into a later discussion. What is China actually playing in the Southeast Asian region? Of course, as an economic power, but then we know the 9-line controversy with South China Sea, and most of these ASEAN countries have an issue with that, and China has been quite belligerent also on that level. So I mean, what is China's role? Even before this ASEAN meet happened, China just gave out a very terse message. It said that ASEAN countries shouldn't be looking at being in some power blocks, which is to say, you know, that don't get sucked up into the influence of the United States and its allies. And then we have India on one side and you have Australia on the other side, and Japan actually trying to also engage with. So a lot of geopolitical activity surrounding ASEAN.
Absolutely. Let me put it very blatantly and very starkly, because there is one point when you want to understand your strategic environment, the diplomats must give way to plain and simple language. When China says that don't be part of any regional grouping, diplomatic grouping, etc., what it is actually saying is that you're so geographically so close to China that if you become part of any bloc, any grouping of that kind, it will be a threat to China, which China will never ever accept. When China talks about groupings, China is telling ASEAN countries that we are so close, we are there, right there. And anything that is not acceptable to China would never be allowed to happen in this area. That is what China is actually telling the ASEAN. And the ASEAN, they have no option but to take these kind of warnings, and I would call even ultimatums, very seriously. Because first of all, look at the whole region, in fact, Indo-China. Why is it called Indo-China? Because of the influence of both India and China in these countries. If you look at the demographics of these countries, the majority of populations in most of them are natives, of course, whether Malay in Malaysia and Singapore or in Indonesia, and beside them, Indians and Chinese. You go to Vietnam, it's Chinese mostly, or Indian origin have come recently for business. But if we look at the history, the oldest 2nd century Bison temples are in Vietnam that show the presence of India there in that area even before history begins for the area. So you look at Cambodia, Indians over there, Laos, I give the example of the ICSC. So number one, there is a huge influence of both India and China in the region. To the extent that in many countries, and Laos is a good example of it, where they competed with each other for influence, for trade and for political in terms of who will be actually ruling over there. So it has all happened there where they came together in terms of competition. And China's biggest objection, if I can say, or concern in the area, sorry, objection is the wrong word, concern in the area is, can India become an actual challenge to Chinese influence in the region? That is what worries it. And therefore, anything where India comes in, either in terms of defense trade or in terms of trade into commodities, services, projects, like we did connectivity projects in Indochina, we did data centers in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Anything that India does becomes a challenge to China, particularly recently when they find that India's closeness to USA and the other countries can become even a greater challenge to China. So what I'm seeing in that area now is trade, economy, political influences, and competition or aggressiveness from China coming together to become a big challenge in Indo-Pacific.
Well, but then, you know, when we see that particular aspect, we're talking about Quad, India is part of Quad. Someone was actually saying the arch around China, you know, the arc around China, with Japan being the strongest on the northern front and India in the southern part of it. But the rest of the countries in that arc doesn't fall into a category where they can militaristically challenge China, except for Vietnam to an extent, because they have a history of a war, and Vietnam does claim victory against the Chinese. But other than that, the issue is that most of these nations tend to be, you know, packed between superpowers, and they have no chance of negotiating other than saying that we have trade ties, we have just trade ties with everyone, and just we want to chart our own course. Is this the reason why India never pursued full membership in the ASEAN, or was what could have restricted India from going ahead for it?
No, I don't think that was a reason. That was a reason. I think. And I'm again speaking very honestly from my own experience. I think we underestimated ASEAN.
Okay.
When ASEAN was formed, immediately after Singapore emerged on the scene, And the ASEAN countries, they looked at forming a bloc to promote economic cooperation between them for many, many years. If I recall correctly, practically 1 decade, that economic cooperation remained only a mantra on paper without leading anywhere. Because please do remember that Singapore required cooperation of other ASEAN countries for its own export trade. It was developing after 1962 as a kind of a port, as a kind of a transfer center for the goods and services. It began to develop at that time. But Singapore was not taken even at that time as a kind of competition as other countries. So the whole group consisting of what? Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. It was not seen as a serious grouping. When Cambodia happened, I remember in 1979 or 1980, when Cambodia happened, and the entire group came together again very, very fiercely and very strongly to stop the threat of communism. Communism has been seen always as a big threat by these countries. So when they came together to basically resolve the situation in Cambodia, and Vietnam attacked Cambodia, that is when actually ASEAN began to emerge very strongly. We should have seen that, and we should have tried to become partners of ASEAN. But it was not really seen as a very strong organization. We underestimated. We began to take ASEAN seriously only as an economic partner in 1990, when we were on the road down the economic ruin. And we wanted to basically, because culturally they were similar, they were our friends, they were practically India's backyard, and therefore the greatest expectation that when we want an economic partnership, they will understand our need and they will come together with us, as it happened. So I think that is when our partnership became stronger. But no, we did not really say that no to ASEAN membership because of this, because of communism or because of other power factor. If I have time, let me just respond to
yes, Mr. Goyal, you have the time.
Yeah. You see, you talked about the arc of the powerful countries around ASEAN, Japan, you quoted Australia, etc., etc. Yes, there is that arc. But if you see the structure of meetings now, ASEAN countries have been always conscious that they could become a region of conflict or challenge in the region because of their economic progress. Because China will want to keep them as their backyard, as a kind of a supply chains, etc., for China. And China may want to retain control or influence in the region, replacing the others, including the USA, Japan, etc. But ASEAN knew that on their own, and the key phrase is that on their own, they would not have the capacity to take China on or to take any other security challenge on. And East Asia Summit, as well as the ASEAN defense ministers meet, were the two instruments that developed to basically bring the group together in a security arrangement. East Asia Summit is a security arrangement where India is a member, Japan is a member, South Korea is a member, the US is a member. Their assumption was that if every country is a member of one common organization, it will deter any kind of precipitate action from them. And I think East Asia Summit from that point of view has served a good purpose. So if you do not see conflict emerging in the area, except with the exception of strong statements, objections, etc., it's all because I think they know that statements, aggression, etc., is not going to serve ASEAN. They're too small on their own, but they become important factor when they come together with other members, other strong countries in the arc.
Or also, Mr. Goyal, I was actually saying how Myanmar is one country of oddities when it comes to ASEAN. It's still part of the ASEAN group, but it is the only country that has not realized its economic potential because of the military junta there. It was supposed to have hosted ASEAN in 2026, but that has also been problematic. It's not going to host it. But then for us, Myanmar becomes the link point for ASEAN. We are talking about land trade and other possibilities that we could have with Myanmar. But that full-fledged possibility of exploiting Myanmar's economic potential has not been, possible at all. Do you think that in ASEAN, Myanmar is the weak link right now?
Absolutely. It's a weak link, not because of just military junta. That's a factor, that it has been politically so unstable that they have not really had given time for economic development, doing projects, etc. But I mentioned earlier that it was so close to India. There were many Bollywood songs more made on the basis of Rangoon and Burma. So it was very prosperous country at one time. That is number one. I think what has happened is that Myanmar is also the triangle, the golden part of the golden triangle. And in all that hilly area, it remains the main center for growth of drugs, development of and drug trade from Myanmar through Golden Triangle into ASEAN and into South Asia. So that has remained as a kind of a threat. Also, because of the kind of the topography it has remained central for many of the insurgencies and the movements challenging the legitimate governments of neighboring countries. Bangladesh comes into picture, India, Thailand, Laos, China. I can't even count how many such groups China is supporting. For the same reason, it remains important for China, where it wants to use the insurgencies to achieve its own objectives in keeping the governments in those other neighboring countries unstable. India is one of them. For the same reason, that because other countries want to misappropriate their positioning vis-a-vis Myanmar, particularly the junta, has continued to exploit that factor for their own junta military gains, which obviously comes at the expense of civil society. I'm quite hopeful that as ASEAN becomes more stable, when economically grows more, and as I think India begins to play a greater role in Myanmar and in the Indo-Pacific, situation should change. We need to be also equally more confident about our ability to manage our problems, internal security problems within our own territory. If Myanmar can revert to a civilian rule, everybody knows, and this is no secret, that if there is one reason why we work with the military government in Myanmar is because we know of their control over the possible insurgencies.
Well, that's an interesting point as well. We are joined in by Sandeep Dixit, the Associate Editor of the Tribune. Sandeep, how do you see our engagement with ASEAN? I was asking, former Indian diplomat Suresh K. Goyal also about it. We had an extensive discussion on this as well. And, how do you see that particular engagement with ASEAN? The Prime Minister has been given a great welcome by the diaspora in Indonesia. But I think in a post-COVID world, engaging with ASEAN has become quite critical, isn't it?
Yeah, as an outsider who was not part of the system, I would say India has a big mountain to climb. The image that you're seeing is not the only image. There was a US ASEAN also held, China ASEAN, Australia ASEAN, South Korea ASEAN. And in the post-COVID world, unfortunately, we have fallen one step behind. We are the only country which has not signed the RCEP with the ASEAN. So in that respect, I suppose there's a lot of catching up to do. The hill is so steep that you can imagine that India has not been able to make South Korea budge from its stand on not revising the CEPA that it has signed with South Korea. So with the entire ASEAN, with the China bogey hanging there, and with the fear of the other Asian tigers coming into India, it will be a very uphill thing because ASEAN, as you know, is primarily an economic bloc. Security comes later, and on security it is very divided. On economy is the only thing that holds all of them together, including the late four entrants, LCVM, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So we have to really do some very, very creative thinking on RCEP and on greater economic intensity with the ASEAN countries before we can think of really coming up to the level of the first three countries in the ASEAN outer ring. The first three countries in the ASEAN ring, as you would know, are South Korea, Japan, and China. We, along with Australia and New Zealand, are in the second concentric outer ring. And now China is speaking of moving on to FTA 3.0 with ASEAN. So that is why very quick, very creative thinking will have to be done in the corridors of the Commerce Ministry and in the corridors of the South.
Well, you're saying it's the Commerce Ministry and engagement is only economics when it comes to ASEAN. Cultural ties have also been there. I think we have not exploited that enough other than trying to engage them diplomatically. But you're saying we are quite late and other countries have already in fact taken the advantage of it. When we talk about the trade agreement that we couldn't sign with ASEAN countries, do you think that India's protectionism is still a hindrance when it comes to deeper engagement with these nations? Protectionism in certain contexts.
I think it is always better to evaluate the statements made by other countries about the ease of doing business in India. So on the World Bank rankings, we have climbed a bit, but people still talk of very high tariffs. And in fact, former President Donald Trump, 10 days back, he again called India some tariff name calling he did. So there is the increased perception all over. Canada has halted its trade talks. The free trade agreement with UK is going nowhere. UAE is the only functional and thriving free trade agreement, but we know what it is actually. Not a really full-fledged trade agreement with any major developing countries so far. So there is definitely a lot of protectionism, and the Indian industry does a considerable bit of navel gazing instead of going outside and foraying into the world, which PM Modi and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman have repeatedly stated that, and they've asked the Indian industry to go out. And more than ever, this government at least is not shy of public hand-holding with Indian businesses. It is not shy of talking to major multinationals in US. PM has repeatedly held roundtables with major multinationals in US. But it is also up to the Indian industry to show some entrepreneurial spirit. In fact, on the other hand, in the past 4 years in the post-COVID world, what might have constrained the government's hand in signing the RCEP or signing more free trade agreements is the fact that investment from the private industry in India has been very low. It has always been government expenditure that has been keeping up the GDP growth rate and propping up the economy and leading to a multiplier effect. So I would also talk about industry's role in this respect. And the government alone cannot really drag trade agreements on its own.
All right. Just let's in fact listen to what Prime Minister Modi had said at the summit. We'll just listen into the Prime Minister's speech there. In fact, he said that he is pitching for closer cooperation with ASEAN. Let's listen in.
Rashtrapati Widodo, Your Majesty, Excellencies, नमस्कार. हमारी पार्टनरशिप हमने चौथे दशक में प्रवेश कर रही है. ऐसे में भारत आसियान समिट उसको को-चेयर करना मेरे लिए बहुत ही प्रसन्नता का विषय है. इस समिट के शानदार आयोजन के लिए राष्ट्रपति विडोडो को मैं हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं और उनका आभार व्यक्त करता हूं. और आसियान समूह की कुशल अध्यक्षता के लिए उनको बहुत बहुत बधाई, बहुत बहुत अभिनंदन. कंबोडिया के प्रधानमंत्री हिज एक्सेलेंसी हुन मानेट को हाल ही में पदभार ग्रहण करने के लिए मैं हार्दिक बधाई देता हूं. मैं इस बैठक में ऑब्जर्वर के रूप में तिमोर लेस्ते के प्रधानमंत्री हिज एक्सेलेंसी सेनाना गुजमाओ का भी हृदय से स्वागत करता हूं। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसी, हमारी हिस्ट्री और ज्योग्राफी भारत और आसियान को जोड़ते हैं। साथ ही साझा वैल्यूज, क्षेत्रीय एकता, शांति, समृद्धि और मल्टीपोलर वर्ल्ड में साझा विश्वास भी हमें आपस में जोड़ता है। आसियान भारत की एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी का केंद्रीय स्तंभ है। भारत आसियान सेंट्रलिटी और इंडो पैसिफिक पर आसियान के आउटलुक का पूर्ण समर्थन करता है। भारत के इंडो पैसिफिक इनिशिएटिव में भी आसियान क्षेत्र का प्रमुख स्थान है। पिछले वर्ष हमने भारत आसियान फ्रेंडशिप ईयर मनाया और आपसी संबंधों को एक कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप का रूप दिया। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, आज वैश्विक अनिश्चितताओं के माहौल में भी हर क्षेत्र में हमारे आपसी सहयोग में लगातार प्रगति हो रही है। यह हमारे संबंधों की ताकत और रेजिलियंस का प्रमाण है। इस वर्ष की आसियान समिट की थीम है आसियान मैटर्स, एपिसेंट्रम ऑफ ग्रोथ। आसियान मैटर्स क्योंकि यहां सभी की आवाज सुनी जाती है और आसियान इज एपिसेंट्रम ऑफ ग्रोथ क्योंकि वैश्विक विकास में आसियान क्षेत्र की अहम भूमिका है। वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर की यही भावना भारत की G20 अध्यक्षता की भी थीम है। योर मैजेस्टी, एक्सेलेंसीज, 21वीं सदी एशिया की सदी है, हम सबकी सदी है। इसके लिए आवश्यक है कि हम एक रूल्स बेस्ड पोस्ट कोविड वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर का निर्माण और मानव कल्याण के लिए सबका प्रयास, फ्री और ओपन इंडो पैसिफिक की प्रगति में और ग्लोबल साउथ की आवाज को बुलंद करने में हम सबके साझे हित है। मुझे विश्वास है कि आज हमारी बातचीत से भारत और आसियान क्षेत्र के भावी भविष्य को और सुदृढ़ बनाने के लिए नए संकल्प लिए जाएंगे। कंट्री कोऑर्डिनेटर सिंगापुर आगामी अध्यक्ष लाओ पीडीआर और आप सभी के साथ भारत कंधे से कंधा मिलाकर काम करने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध है। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Well, also information coming in that the Prime Minister has left from Jakarta. That is what we understand right now. Information coming in, the Prime Minister leaving for India. He said that it was a short and fruitful visit to Indonesia, and he said that he will follow up on all the aspects of ensuring deeper ties are engaged with the ASEAN countries. That's the Prime Minister who is heading back to the country. Of course, it's been a series of foreign summits that he's been attending. BRICS, then you have the G20 in India, and of course now the ASEAN as well. So the Prime Minister, in fact, busy on the foreign summits fund as well as engaging with foreign leaders. Well, that was the picture of the meet as it happened in ASEAN, with the Prime Minister shaking hands with the leaders of the ASEAN countries. Well, let me get back to Suresh Goel. Suresh, one of the things that Mr. Sandeep has in fact raised is that or rather when I have put it out, is this, that protectionism is something that is probably spoiling our relation when it comes to economic engagement with ASEAN. How much of protectionism is ASEAN willing to accept when it comes to trading with India? Because it has its own way of trading, and most of them do not have the kind of protectionism that is seen in India. But India's domestic policies, in fact, tend to, or domestic compulsions rather, tend to move towards protectionism. So protectionism, the issue of trying to bring ASEAN together in that engagement, how much of a difficult challenge has it been? I think it's in on mute mode for a moment.
Hi.
Yes, no.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible,
okay.
yeah.
Let me put a bit of a rider here. And again, I'm talking purely because I've spent so many years in that area, Singapore, Malaysia. I was ambassador to Laos, that it's, I can almost feel it really. Protectionism has been an issue in India-ASEAN trade for a long time, even till 2000, early 2000, 2010, etc. It was always a problem, and there was a feeling that unless we are able to really take care of the demands of our own industry, who felt left to the wolves in case that the agreement was signed. But I think that kind of a fear of others in trade slowly eroded over a period of time. And finally, when I retired in 2013, I saw signs already that there was a greater confidence in the industry, not the governments, where the confidence was already there. But I think with the development of our economy and the industry, they have begun to really see each other as complementary to each other and to be able to work with each other. That was happening because the goods FTA between India and ASEAN was signed ultimately. It was a service FTA which was creating problem. But you are referring to RCEP, basically. RCEP, the problem was not just protectionism. RCEP, the problem was that the ASEAN and Chinese economy had become so deeply interlinked that if we were to accept all those conditions for trade and openness, I know fully well that our markets would have been flooded with the Chinese goods.
Okay.
And in a sense, through ASEAN, we would have been actually allowing the Chinese goods, consumer goods, some of them shoddy quality, even though Chinese will object vociferously, but all those things will be actually coming to the Indian market. And with the kind of labor control they have got, the price control they have got, capital cost control they have got, it would have been no match for our industry and the Chinese thing. I want to give you an anecdote, if you don't mind. I was in South Africa as Consul General of India in Johannesburg, and therefore the trade was my beat. And there is one trade fair in Johannesburg which is not public. Public can come in, but mostly it is really visited only by the serious business people for various reasons. There was one businessman who came and he saw the India stall, he went to Chinese stall, compared prices, etc., came back to the Indian trader, manufacturer, and said that if you can reduce the price by 1 cent, I will place the order for you, otherwise it doesn't work out. The Indian business was so confident, he computed the prices and he said, you are most welcome to go to the Chinese stall and buy their product, but at this price, I cannot assure the quality of what I sell, and I do not want to sell a shoddy quality good. The South African businessman saw the point and placed the order with the Indian business. So I think we are coming into our own, but we had to protect. We had to ensure that the Indian market does not get flooded with Chinese goods affecting our industry. And that's a very valid point of view. Singapore saw it. They saw our objections, but they keep hoping that will become part of RCEP. And they do it because without India's participation, the global supply chains remain broken.
Okay.
The next industrial development destination is India. And I can say this with confidence, not because of Vietnam, but the point really is that the Chinese market is becoming so badly affected. They were basically depending on the supply chains and the domestic markets. Both are affected in China now. And if they want to really, if the industry from the Western countries want to go somewhere, the only places in their minds are either Vietnam or India.
All right. So, but one more thing among the ASEAN countries is the emergence of Vietnam, as you know, they call it the little dragon who has made it big.
Yes.
I've had a lot of friends who suddenly speak about Vietnam, having visits to Vietnam, setting up of factories in Vietnam, and also training of staff in Vietnam. So, Vietnam's engagement with India is also becoming much more deeper. How do you see the rise of Vietnam among the ASEAN countries?
I think one very important reason for this. First of all, Vietnam is so close to China with excellent facilities for of ports for supplies abroad. Their labor is not as fraught with the difficulties as our labor is, capital cost and everything. In a sense, Vietnamese business culture is like a Chinese business culture where they will cut down and they will compete fiercely to promote their products, etc. I think we should know how to work with Vietnam and also to promote our own conditions for inviting other investments. We are there. We will have to work on our own labor policies. We will have to work on our own land acquisition policies to make it profitable for other investors to come. And they are coming. They are coming in the service sector, but I'm quite sure that we will break ground also in the manufacturing sector quite soon.
Manufacturing, when we talk about manufacturing, you know, one of the things where China has actually outdid us has been in the manufacturing sector. We are still, you know, in that group where we are saying, you know, we are the back office of the world when it comes to software or handling. We are still in those services, and of course we are using those aspects of it to grow in the area as well when it comes to Indo-China region. But then how much of a manufacturing cloud do we require that would actually help us kind of synergize with the Southeast Asian nations?
A lot. Quite a lot, really. And I would say that not to just synergize with Southeast Asian neighbors, because when I look at trade in a global sense, and we need to really grow globally, and we need to do quite a lot on policy fronts in terms of energizing our own manufacturing sector. We are realizing the difficulties. We know the difficulties, but I remain hopeful that the government will resolve those problems in the interest of not just our markets, but also our own domestic industry and the consumer. Because those days when you could control trade flows with licensing, quotas, etc., are long gone now. I don't think those instruments can come back and they can work again. A market has to develop on the basis of consumer and industry preferences. If they do not get what they want at the rate which they think is valid and profitable, they will go somewhere else. It's as simple as that. And therefore, there is a lot of compulsion already to really reform and I mentioned these two before, labor policies and land acquisition processes. But I remain confident that we are going to do it.
Okay, so a series of reforms that would help us to be competitive. Now, let me come to the security aspect of it. We've been speaking extensively about our economic engagement. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific region, I mean, the Prime Minister also said about Indo-Pacific region being the area where we need to, in fact, see our presence also felt. And he said the cooperation of the Indo-Pacific region area. When we say Indo-Pacific, we are seeing a huge region of influence, huge region of countries that are into global trade, and also a lot of global trade happens through these areas as well. Indo-Pacific pivot has what the US has also been saying, and you know, within this Quad alliance you have the AUKUS, which is to, you know, bypass us and get Australia be given sensitive technology like nuclear submarines. So you see the whole series of developments also happening when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region. What is the US actually trying to do when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region? Everybody says, of course, the writing on the wall is about containing China, but is it just merely containing China?
That is, I think, the most important part of the pivot. But when we think of containing China, we think of containing China in terms of sanctions, in terms of military measures, etc., etc. But we don't realize that it's not just a military China which is a problem. An economically grown China has become such a threat that now that after pandemic, the Chinese economy has begun to decline, impacting on the global supply chains. The whole world is actually going through a kind of a shock. So is it really legitimate for the global economy to be controlled or impacted so much by just one country? I think that will always be a serious thing, really. Not it should never happen that one country controls everything. And when we talk about containing China, the USA talked about containing China. That containment is in terms of both as a military threat as well as an economic entity. And that's a reason I give much more weight to the recent visit of the US Commerce Secretary. And when she said that China is uninvestable, I think that was a very, very cataclysmic call on China, really, that if you call China remains uninvestable, that kind of a call is real bad. So therefore, when we talk about India and what is USA looking at, I would look at it in two terms. We will need to be very cautious about becoming part of any military kind of an arrangement. Please do remember that we have a huge continental border with China, and therefore we need to be much more cautious in terms of a military engagement than a country like Australia or Japan can be, where the only issue is maritime security. We have both. But I think we will be much more successful in becoming an alternative economic powerhouse in the region. Economic powerhouse, social powerhouse, disaster management, health, technology. There are so many issues. China is now emerging as a threat in the artificial intelligence areas. I'm sure that we can emerge as an option. And ours will be really much more softer option, much more hospitable kind of an option than China is, where for them, their own just pure narrow interest comes first. So India must look at Indo-Pacific in terms of economic, social, health, technology, other parameters. Military, of course, is always there. But I think that priority can go to other countries for the time being.
In fact, thank you, Suresh, for giving us that perspective. I mean, it's been a complete engagement on ASEAN and the importance of ASEAN and how India has been trying to engage with a very important region of the world. It's not about economics alone. It is also about security. It's also about the shadow of China that dominates on this region and the challenges that India has when it comes to a post-COVID world and how to become economically relevant in that region and at the same time ensure that our influence stays. With that, it's a wrap on this discussion. On the other side, stay tuned. We give you more updates from the G20.
China won't let us rest easy on our borders, but they will keep flooding our markets. What does Xi Jinping really want?
I think he wants the Indian market, no doubt about it. It's really a matter of showing their dominance.
India's great Chinese conundrum.